Buyurun hocam.
Okay, good evening, dear participants. Welcome to the evening session of the second day of our conference. And I am really pleased and happy to be chairing this session and to be presenting Professor Peter Stoett. Peter Stoett's main areas of research expertise include international relations and law, global environmental politics, and human rights. He is especially interested in critical perspectives on the many nuanced intersections between these themes. Current research focuses on biodiversity conservation policy, transnational environmental crime, marine pollution prevention, climate justice, and Canadian-American environmental relations. He has also worked extensively on genocide and war crimes prevention and punishment. Prior to joining Ontario Tech University, Dr. Stoett was director of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center and chair of the Department of Political Science at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec. Currently, he is co-chairing the first global assessment on invasive alien species conducted by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He has also worked with the United Nations Environmental Programme as a coordinating lead author on the 6th flagship Global Environmental Outlook report, which won the 2020 Association of American Publishers Prose Awards category excellence winner for environmental science, and was a contributing expert on the 2020 IPBES workshop report on biodiversity and pandemics. Dr. Stoett has written, co-written, and co-edited more than 10 books and more than 15 peer-reviewed articles, chapters in edited books, and occasional papers. Dr. Stoett, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to give this presentation today. It's a real pleasure. It might be a bit off topic. I've looked at some of the papers that you've had presented so far, so this might be a bit different, but I think it's just as important, of course, to discuss environmental violence, or what we call equal violence, within the context of any discussion of what violence means today, given the climate catastrophe that we face collectively. I'm hoping that this would be a topic that does interest you. So we can just begin with this. If you'd like to turn to the first slide, please. I don't have too many slides, but I never miss the opportunity to promote a book, of course. So this is a very recent book, which I co-authored with Dion Omro, who's a postdoc doing some research with me at Ontario Tech University. And I like to leave this picture up there just a while, because not only does it reminds us perhaps of the existential threat that is being faced by the orangutan as a species in, of course, Southeast Asia today. They're faced with this threat because of palm oil plantations, but a lot of what goes on is quite violent and illegal, not just because the orangutans themselves are being killed, this beautiful species, but also because people that are trying to protect them have also been subjected to violence, in particular in Indonesia. So, and the book, I think, does, in many respects, try to remind us of what it is we're losing when equal violence takes place. So we're losing the opportunity to see such beautiful things as this in the wild. You can see, of course, orangutans in many zoos around the world, but it's not the same thing. I'll take the liberty of reading some excerpts from the book during my talk, but of course I'm open to any questions as we conclude, and there might be a few periods where I ad lib or what have you. But if there is a common theme across dimensions of social thought today, it is that great change is upon us, that the environment which sustains us and grants us the ability to even think of enjoyable, wonderful futures is in a form of peril that could only be eclipsed, perhaps, by the advent of full-scale thermonuclear war or a calamitous meteor impact. To be clear, it's not Earth itself that is at stake here. It's the thin layer of life, which we call the biosphere. And more importantly, the species Homo sapiens, which, for better or worse, inhabits and dominates it. Climate change and the heated political discourse on doing something about it is the most visible manifestation of a discourse and a broader crisis in the human-environment relationship. But biodiversity loss, massive natural resource consumption, and the interlinked oceans crisis, toxic pollution, ozone layer depletion, and many other concerns are all related. Global in scope, local in destruction, and caused in some manner by human conduct. The rapid spread of the zoonotic novel coronavirus, COVID-19, reminds us that habitat destruction and climate change will induce more newly emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases in the future. And needless to say, people have done this. No one hurls the lightning bolts that start forest fires, but we certainly help dry out the forest surface so that it burns quickly, much quicker than in previous centuries and certainly decades even. No one decides how often and when endangered species will mate and propagate, but we have certainly made their survival in the wild increasingly difficult, if not impossible. Human agency, then, is at the causal heart of our ecological footprint, and any attendant angst over our continued collective survival is well deserved. Meanwhile, we continue to exploit not just the natural environment, but each other. One can plausibly argue that great advances in human dignity, freedom, and equality have been made since the days of feudalism and slave economies, but it is impossible to deny the continuation of a global political economy predicated largely on mass exploitation. We are in the midst of a massive act of violence against nature and attendant crimes against humanity. The socio-legal structures that facilitate this bear scrutiny and must be reformed if we are to get off this path. So the outlook we espouse in the book is rooted firmly in the premise that we must look at environmental harms as clusters of ecological, social, and economic damage. Eco-violence, whether it crosses borders in its transmission or not, and it often does, thus the word transnational in our title, is a threat to both environmental justice and human security, and I'll expand on that theme momentarily. It can also be seen as a violation of the inherent rights of nature, if that conceptual lens is adapted. If nature has rights, and we openly think that it does and should, then violations of those rights are a form of violence, just as violations of human rights are usually regarded as violent acts as well. However, the question of what constitutes violence as a concept remains central to an understanding of the politics, international, national, and local, of environmental crime, when we take human security as one of our main concerns. If we are linking human security and environmental crime or violence against the environment, one of the most obvious overlaps is the existence or the threat of violence against both the environment and humans involved in this process. But what do we mean by violence? And I know you've spent already many days talking about this, so I will not offer any sort of definition that transcends what's already been said, I'm sure. The word violence means many things to many people. Violence is ugly, it's inflicted, it's a violation, but it can be beautiful, choreographed, even emulated. It's unfortunate, disproportionate, random, personal, political, epistemic, structural, mechanical. Violence is pain, it is release. It is oppressive, it is liberating. It is shamed, it is outrightly commercialized and packaged and sold, commodified even. It is the core human reflex, according to some. It is the result of institutional cultural construction, according to others. It is unleashed rage or calculated sadism. Violence echoes in the collective soul, the murdered demanding revenge. Violence takes and frees slaves and forces labor as well as progressive change. And yet a definition, or at least an employable typology of eco-violence is central to the task of understanding how it can affect those who are, as the African saying has it, caught on the grass between feuding elephants. We would simply refer to equal conflict if all we applied was contestation or the clash of interest over natural resources. We want to go beyond that in the definition that we employ. The use of the term violence certainly implies that some form of injury or violation of persons is taking place or could occur as a result of factors present in the physical environment beyond the mere existence of social conflict. The case studies generated by interdisciplinary analysts tend to assume that equal violence is the potential dependent variable, but they rarely actually discuss the meaning of the term itself. Such a discussion raises ancillary questions about the meaning of human conflict, human nature relations, structural oppression, human security, and a plethora of other factors, which together constitute the conceptual landscape of equal violence. It will also raise the perplexing fact that the fight against equal violence can, in itself, be quite violent in nature, whether it is the dispossession of people dependent on natural resources for conservationist purposes, shoot on sight park ranger policies in response to poaching, or the use of coerced labor to extract the rare earth minerals necessary for producing battery operated vehicles that we all hope will help get us away from climate change. In his usual succinct brilliance in hand, Charles Tilley, an author, North American author, provides three prevalent and competing views of the meaning of violence: as propensity-driven behavior, as instrumental interaction, and as cultural form. Treatments of violence as propensity-driven behavior locate its causes within the actor, calling attention to genetic, emotional, or cognitive peculiarities that incline a given individual, group, or category of persons to damaging behavior. Portrayals of violence as instrumental interaction characterize everything from petty assaults to all-out warfare as means, however inefficient and self-defeating they may be, to power, wealth, prestige, or other ends. To call violence a cultural form, as in the claim that because of the frontier, slavery, or capitalist competition, the United States has an exceptionally violent culture, argues that the ready availability of certain ideas, practices, models, and beliefs itself promotes violent action. This ushers us toward the inevitable chestnut in international relations theory. I know some of you are international relations theorists, which is the agent structure debate. The tricky question of intent is central to all three of these conceptions. Within the broader international relations and development literature, the study of war and the brutalities of imperialism and imperialisms have put violence on the center stage of world history. At the very least, certain types of violence have received privileged attention as political thought and politics have evolved. A condition itself of epistemic violence, recognized by feminist scholarship both within and outside of the formal study of international relations, and no doubt in much of the literature which you have covered in this conference. Common sense would dictate that war and extreme exploitation cannot be nonviolent, but there is much less consensus about the ethical acceptability of such strategic or instrumental violence, or the means versus ends or consequentialist arguments that often characterize the literature, and how all this relates especially to nature and ecology. Even this brief discussion makes it clear that consensus would be impossible to achieve on this specific question. We face the additional question, however, of how all this relates to the environment and to a political geography of violence. It should be clear at the outset that even the less direct terminology often employed, such as environmentally induced conflict, is regarded by many as fundamentally flawed, as it relies on preconceived causalities, intermingles ecocentric with anthropocentric philosophies, and neglects the motivations and subjective perceptions of local actors. Yet it does direct our attention toward possible links between violence and environmental degradation, which is obviously an important association if we value human life or nature or both. So we had better have some sort of common understanding about what the former term means. I'll begin, however, with what we suggest it does not mean. There are still strong tendencies to conflate nature and violence as similar or mutually symbiotic concepts. On the one hand, it could be suggested that this simply reflects the violent nature the predatory-prey symbiosis of nature itself. This is a theme close to the hearts of instinctivists or sociobiologists, and part of the broader discussion of the origins of war, territorial and interpersonal aggression and predation and imperialism. Eco-violence committed by human beings may simply be the order of things, and interventions, humanitarian or not, are therefore counterproductive in the long run, merely delaying the inevitable. Paul Robbins explains the logic of what he terms crude Malthusianism. Since famine and starvation were essential to controlling runaway human populations, such events are natural and inevitable. So too is our onslaught against nature as we struggle to survive as a species. If this onslaught results in our collective demise, then that will be the best gift we can impart to nature. It's obviously a very misanthropic interpretation. The perspective carries little promise for advancing human or environmental security. But after a short leap guided by the lifeboat ethics of Garrett Hardin and company, does push us closer to a modern social Darwinism, fixated on fantasies about population control. Invasive species, predatory killers, stalking lionesses, charging rams, bloodthirsty bats, flesh-tearing sharks. No shortage of film footage here, much of it genuine, but much more orchestrated to accommodate the camera, and a commercial camera often at that. The need to cull herds on occasion for the sake of future generations of genetic winners is a common theme in both biological and political terms. Eco-violence is not a problem inherently, and it is often a good thing, and not only because of its evolutionary inevitability. After all, the specter of eco-violence can add prescriptive urgency and pragmatic value to the promotion of environmental protection. It can help raise the awareness needed to save our own species from destroying the nest in which we all live. So while deliberately avoiding the hostile arenas of debate over original sin, sociobiology, or psychoanalysis, we can argue that this perspective is thankfully the antithesis of the normative project which animates most research in the area of environmental crises and social conflict today. Can we have the next slide, please? So, yeah, thank you. Maybe go back. There we go. Okay. Yeah, as was mentioned in the very kind introduction, I'm currently co-chairing an international assessment of biodiversity loss. This particular assessment covers invasive alien species and the impact that they're having on local ecosystems and human communities. This is for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPPES, and most of you have probably heard about it or at least seen it in the media because of this, our global assessment report, which came out a couple of years ago, which essentially was, of course, very alarming in terms of the predictions it makes about species loss and its impact on the quality of life of human beings. It's hard to conceive of violence on behalf of even these pernicious, invasive, and damaging creatures, however. So before we start saying that nature is violent and therefore we shouldn't be too worried about violence against nature, we should bear this in mind. The ethical questions raised by invasive species offer an interesting example of how futile a perspective which equates humans with them actually is. While they are certainly problematic for the indigenous species that they overcrowd, overshadow, devour, or outmate, this does not mean bioinvaders have anything but the best of intentions, and their intention basically is survival. It is difficult to pin moral agency on them, but fairly impossible by most understandings to not pin it on human beings. Adding to the metaphor, invasive species are often the result of either accidental or purposeful introductions by human beings, usually through trade and tourism, but also often through military activity, amplified by ongoing climate change, widespread plastic and other forms of pollution, disease transmission, land degradation, and other variables which can exacerbate the spread of invasive alien species and the loss of biodiversity. So on the contrary, we have a vested interest in protecting ourselves from microbial invasions, and this extends to the protection of local ecosystems from exogenous bioassault. but many technical responses to bioinvasion can, according to some definitions, be ecocidal in nature. They are deemed by most observers, especially biologists, to observe the greater good of conserving biodiversity. One of the things we struggle with in the assessment, of course, is that there are cases where the only way to deal with invasive species is to kill them, to eradicate them from the local area that they have infested. And this raises all sorts of ethical issues about our right to do that. I won't get into that today, but other than to say that even conservation, of course, sometimes necessitates what we might refer to as violence against nature. Putting this back into the human realm, we may revert to Petri dish ethics in relation to human population movements, but the array of moral ascriptions is hardly uniform. Moral agency remains both foundational and optically fundamental. More to the point, perhaps, scarcity itself is not a trustworthy independent variable. As Ken Konka and Greg Wallace suggest, much of the eco-conflict literature has invoked scarcity without paying attention to how social relations create the conditions for resource capture or other forms of social scarcity. Conversely, the precise mechanisms by which resource wealth may induce or sustain violence do remain disputed. There's no consensus in the literature exactly what causes this. Other studies have suggested there is a limited explanatory power to what some label eco-scarcity theory, but poverty and dysfunctional institutions remain central, independent variables. Another widespread assumption that conflict over natural resources is key to explaining civil wars, especially in the post-decolonization context, has also hit obstacles when subject to empirical analysis. One study found, for example, that resource conflict did matter, but that the negative effect of agricultural resources on conflict probably is almost twice as large as the positive effect of mineral resources. In other words, scarcity matters, but more in terms of agricultural productivity as a mitigating factor than mineral wars as a causal factor. I can expand on this later if you'd like, but you can apply the same idea to water as well, which I know is a major concern where this conference is located. To be fair to Thomas Homer Dixon and other authors that have looked at resource conflicts, they are well aware of the variations on the theme. And I'm certainly not equating the scarcity research agenda with social Darwinism. While humans are likely to fight over diminished life-sustaining resources, basing an entire subfield of scholarly inquiry on this easiest presumption does not provide us with any prescriptive value, other than the obvious need to avoid situations where life-sustaining resources are threatened with extinction, an imperative already dictated either by the quest for survival or humanitarian concern. We still need an overarching view of what constitutes violence and justice to give this analytic context and normative animation. Can we get the next slide, please? The widely referenced World Health Organization definition of violence is emblematic of an agential position. So violence is basically the result of an agent acting, right? And I'll contrast this with structural violence, of course, which we might argue is more pernicious. So this is the definition here, and you can read that on your own, but I would argue that structural definitions of violence are as important and expand on that. The key word here in this definition is intentional. Structural understandings of mass atrocities, for example, often split on this point, since not all participants are intending the visible outcome of the event. Collective violence refers to violence committed by larger groups of individuals and can be subdivided into social, political, and economic violence. This, again, is a WHO definition. I'd argue there are at least three types of subtypes of agential eco-violence, or purposeful infliction of harm on ecosystems: ecocide, ecological sabotage, and the deliberate or neglectful harm of animals. The last group falls within the category of psychopathic behavior and/or is a manifestation of the mass food industry, which, while quite violent to some, is considered quite routinized and even beneficial to others. Animal lives can be viewed as an implicit component of one of the key themes that I'm discussing today, environmental justice, but to say there's no consensus on that is an understatement. Next slide, please. Ecological sabotage, on the other hand, refers largely to terrorist activity conducted by individuals, states, or other actors designed to harm or frighten human populations. But the term is often used to refer to the actions of radical ecologists who resort to the sabotage of property to protect the natural environment itself. There really isn't much of this going on. This is in my view anyways, an example of how a term itself can be co-opted, right, to try and present a certain framing of events. Despite numerous Hollywood depictions, the vast majority of ecological sabotage, I would argue, is the murder of peaceful environmental activists and or human rights activists in biodiversity hotspots, such as the Amazon region. This is the cover of a recent report, which is put out by Global Witness. It puts out a report each year discussing, or I should say, pardon me, summarizing the extent of violence that are against people who are trying to defend the environment. The statistics are fairly grim. They identified 227 people that were murdered in 2020 and 212 in 2019 that were, I think, could be categorized quite easily as environmental defenders. The state capital organized crime nexus is the main perpetrator of ecological sabotage, and we see this throughout the world. It is pretty intense right now in the Amazon, of course, where we have much contestation over rainforest, but it happens everywhere. And it happens with regard to people trying to protect, for example, those engaged in sea slavery in some fishing operations. Violence against activists or resistors or protectors is a clear problem then, in my view. Governments must do more to protect these brave people from the violence associated with environmental crime in particular, as they try to stop it. And in the case of some governments, including those of Western advanced capitalist societies, state oppression may be the main threat that they force. There's also another side of the proverbial coin when discussing ecological sabotage, which is climate sabotage. This form of sabotage is used to describe a nation's inability to uphold its commitments to curb the emission of greenhouse gases, as evinced through certain countries' egregious failure to ratify international agreements or implement them, and the spread of misinformation on the drivers and impacts of climate change itself. It is such acts of sabotage which undermine the human security of citizens and unborn generations, placing all of humanity in the most perilous of circumstances. Turning to ecocide very quickly, there are different definitions of this term. And of course, there is a movement afoot that you might be aware of to use ecocide as yet another international crime against humanity. Definitions of ecocide have been used widely in the literature. The former includes a maximalist definition, which would basically accept any sort of violence against nature as ecocide. This would involve, for example, driving big cars or flying to academic conferences. We're free from the charge here because we're doing this virtually, but we've all probably flown to academic conferences, eating dubiously farmed salmon and so on. A more minimalist definition refers exclusively to the deliberate destruction of nature as part of a military strategy, aimed not at destroying nature, but at subjugating an enemy. And classic agential violence, regardless of the just war question, in which ecosystems suffer, but the end result is, of course, the prolonged suffering of human populations. And this acts as an indirect collective violence, of course, form of collective violence, pardon me. In between, we have military preparation, which is an especially deleterious activity during the heights of the Cold War and remains a significant factor today, especially if we include incidentals such as greenhouse gas emissions resulting from military production and weapons shipments, problems related to stored toxic wastes, and others. Arguably, ecocide would be easier to define if we simply viewed it as any violation of the rights of nature. And again, there is a movement afoot to use ecocide as the main organizing principle behind international legal actions. A recent reformulation of the term was spread very widely, which more or less adopted that stance. Regardless of the difficulties inherent in translating this into a concrete legal regime, the publicity generated by these tireless efforts is priceless. And I think it's very valuable that this discussion is ongoing. There's also an established body of literature on the impact of the ecological costs of displacement resulting from warfare. including competition over local resources between refugees and host communities. This includes the long-term psychological damage caused by displacement from traditional lands, which harms the ecological self and therefore creates an internal sense of alienation, further blending the line between agential and structural violence, which is where I'm headed here, basically. It's a fine line indeed between the agential and the structural, especially for social scientists looking at events and context from afar. Less fine a line, no doubt, to those in the immediate grip of agential violence, but they would themselves be likely to refer to the injustice of the situation to contextualize it. I was going to discuss Johan Galtung a bit, but many of you probably have heard of him, and he was, by some definitions anyways, one of the original thinkers when it comes to defining structural violence. We can go back to various Marxist interpretations and so forth. But I think it's important to stress that a narrow definition of violence may define it, and here I'm quoting Kumaraswamy, a narrow definition of violence may define it as an act of criminal use of physical force, but this is an incomplete concept. Violence also includes exploitation, discrimination, unequal economic and social structures, and the creation of an atmosphere of religious, cultural, and political violence. While violence against women, for example, is part of a general violence found in the social structures such as class, caste, religion, and ethnicity, and in the way the state controls people, it also encompasses acts of structural violence and forms of control and coercion exercised through hierarchical and patriarchal gendered relationships in the family and society. So the link between agential violence perpetrated by individuals and the structure of exploitation, in my view, is extremely important when we're looking at how we're treating nature today and how we're treating people. How else do we characterize illegal but ongoing and firmly entrenched cocoa production, clearly supported by numerous states involved in the supply chain, in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, for example, which employs anywhere between 100,000 and 400,000 children in backbreaking work, often labeled appropriately, perhaps as slave labor. Next slide, please. Adding to the complexity of the discussion, we note that it is often difficult to gauge complicity in the bigger picture of violence against nature. So many observers hold the World Wildlife Fund, you'll recognize the panda, in high regard, given all it has done to share the message of conservation and promote specific projects acclaimed by celebrities and others. Yet its intimate relationship with many of the corporations that have contributed immeasurable damage to the environment raises interesting questions about agency and consequentialist ethics. As a stinging treatment of the World Wildlife Fund released originally in 2012 suggested, a conspicuously high number of their corporate cohorts have distinguished themselves in the area of environmental pollution. This includes British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, Marine Harvest, Shell, McDonald's, Monsanto, etc. And the world's largest palm oil company, to go back to our orangutan, which is Wilmar. The panda makes them look good, according to the report. They've also been accused of funding guards, for example, that have been accused of using torture and murder in the war against exotic animal poaching. So basically, yeah, there are a few angels involved in transnational eco-violence or study. No one is perfect. WWF has done a great deal of good, particularly in terms of spreading awareness of conservation needs and issues, and in protecting habitat. And its collaboration with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime has produced some excellent analysis of eco-violence. So, right, the glass is half full, I guess is one way to phrase this. The meaning of violence itself is often framed by dominant elites who control media outlets, educational systems, and life opportunities of vulnerable populations. And there's many examples of this. For example, the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, Mexico. The uprising was portrayed as violent, but the poverty and marginalization which preceded it was generally not, since it was structural and not direct violence. Of course, widespread sympathy for the Zapatistas was perhaps evidence of the open recognition of the pernicious nature of structural violence in the first place, as well as its ecological impacts. But the support was only a major factor after the violent response to the demands of a new trade agreement in North America became a mass media event. Next slide, please. I realize I'm starting to run a bit late. Only by defining eco-violence as environmental justice that also threatens human security do we capture both the agential and structural violence with or without direct intent described above, while emphasizing the importance of links between humans and ecosystems, differentiated spatial and virtual communities, and universal needs and individual responsibilities. Of course, environmental justice itself has been defined in competing fashions, but the crux of the concern here is that certain populations or individuals are more likely to be harmed by or suffer the risks associated with environmental problems than others. And this social question needs rectification if we are to deal effectively with those problems. In a concise survey of efforts to provide empirical data on this parameter of fundamental inequality, Mante, an author, American author, defines environmental justice as the disproportionate exposure of communities of color and the poor to pollution and its concomitant effects on health and environment, as well as the unequal environmental protection and environmental quality provided through laws, regulations, government programs, enforcements, and policies. So we have to add violence to this equation, agential, when deliberate harm is caused to ecosystems, as well as structural, when oppressed people suffer disproportionately when environmental conditions worsen by direct change, such as the impacts of climate change, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. And this will strike some bells of recognition for anyone who has looked at the work of Ulrich Beck, who famously referred to the risk society as the modern age, where risk producers suffer less than risk victims, or those more vulnerable to its deleterious effects. The pursuit of environmental justice is also associated with achieving intergenerational justice and interspecies justice, but is mostly associated with debates about distributional inequalities and the actions needed to address them. So we are, to some extent, here back to human rights as the fundamental concern. Not all environmentalists like that, considering it too anthropocentric in nature. But this includes not only present rights, including entitlements and obligations, but also reflects past injustice issues and possible future scenarios. A human rights to environmental protection approach seeks to ensure the natural world does not deteriorate to the point where international guaranteed rights, such as the right to health, property, a family, a private life, culture, and safe drinking water are seriously impaired. So environmental protection is instrumental, not an end in itself. And it is a response to the violence which is often perpetrated on the environment when we exceed taking our needs from nature. In the age of the Anthropocene, any serious thought about what it means to be human and to have corresponding rights and obligations cannot escape the basic fact that we have also redefined what it means to be natural, and some recalibration of survival pathways is in order. But the inequity of risk and ecological harm is a self-evident travesty. As Val Plumwood, who preferred the term environmental classism to racism, writes, in a polity where socially privileged have the main or central role in social decision-making, decisions are likely to reflect their relatively high level of consequential, epistemic, and communicative remoteness from ecological harms. Have distance will survive, basically, and that distance is afforded, of course, by resource inequalities. This brings me back further to human security as a central plank in our understanding of what we can do about violence today. Promoting human security, a term developed by the United Nations Development Program in the early 1990s, and which emanates from the broader concept of security in the field of security studies. At the international level, the human security perspective aims to address threats faced by marginalized peoples in our interconnected globalized world, earmarking human and financial resources for poverty alleviation initiatives. Human security has been tied to environmental protection, of course, but I would argue more needs to be done there. And we also need to revive human security as an ongoing foreign policy concern for all countries. Perhaps newfound concerns about health and environmental justice following a traumatic global event such as COVID-19 pandemic will spur transformational thinking and steer citizens away from a reflexive turn to nationalism and authoritarianism. spurred themselves by violent imagery and mythologies? Perhaps. Yet similar arguments have been made about ecological crises throughout the past half century. Previously, the advent of nuclear weapons was considered by many to be a technological change that would lead invariably to major alterations of the international nation-state system. The global ecological crisis may lead to a similar deconstruction of the rigidities of the state-based system, but there's a decidedly mixed bag of evidence of this transformation. Well, these were no doubt cases of grandly designed carts dragging reluctant horses, as opposed to putting the horse before the cart. The idea that large-scale changes in natural and technological conditions can change social realities is as old as the study of history itself. Fighting transnational eco-violence then must be embedded within the context, and we argue this in the book with much more time and persuasiveness than I'm capable of giving today. The twin imperatives of environmental justice and human security. While the more traditional eco-violence literature typically leads to calls for greater state capacity to manage situations and manage conflict and control the scarcity involved, environmental justice concerns typically advocate more fundamental shifts in power relations and access to natural resources to achieve intersectional and intergenerational justice. Just a quick word, we do cover all sorts of environmental crimes in this book, from forestry to illegal mining to illegal fishing operations and so forth. But we also make sure that we cover climate crime, because that's really, I think, the wave of the future. Violence against the climate, that sounds like an awkward phrase, really, for us right now. I suspect in 10 years it'll be a common phrase. This encompasses not only fraudulent climate change mitigation and adaptation schemes, but the much broader notion of the chronic undervaluation of sincere climate policy by major polluters. And yes, they really do get away with it. Volkswagen, as you might recall, deliberately misled greenhouse gas emission regulators around the world just a few years ago. They paid some fines, it's true, but they are still the second biggest automaker in the world behind Toyota. In fact, are enjoying quite a bit of success, especially with new hybrid models. So maybe they learned their lesson. Maybe on the other hand, the clear involvement of major corporations in committing climate crime is something that we should be very, very concerned about. Ultimately, the root causes of both formal and informal transnational eco-violence, poverty, despair, greed, and ignorance must be overcome if we are to deal with its impacts. Raising awareness about this particular form of violence is therefore central. The pandemic that struck the world community in 2020 revealed the divisions, inequities, fragilities, and interconnectedness of the global political and economic system. If eco-violence is a permanent feature of this social landscape, then we can expect more of the same. Working against it will reveal fissures and weaknesses, challenging the notion that the human species can overcome its most egregious assaults against nature and itself. Yet this is not the time for disengagement from these momentous and mountainous tasks. Unprecedented knowledge of the consequences of human actions and of structural and agential violence now exists. Complex networks have evolved to meet the subsequent challenges. It's time to intensify the quest to install human security and environmental justice as the cornerstones of a new world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stoett, for your excellent talk. And I'm sure there will be some questions and comments from the audience, and the floor is open to questions and comments, please. That was a stimulating presentation about the present problems of the world. And anybody? Maybe, if I may, can I break the ice?
Maybe I put them all to sleep.
Thank you very much. Your talk reminded me of Ernst Schumacher's 1973 book, Small is Beautiful. And Ernst Schumacher says in that book, he points out that the concentrations of bigger economic powers create greater violence against the environment. And considering the present situation of the world, is it ever possible to go back to a smaller world and smaller settlements in the world to stop the violence against environment and to stop the environmental injustice, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways that he was trying to direct us was to thinking about not just about smaller communities, maybe, but about smaller governance structures, right, or more local governance as being more significant. And I think that's key. Decentralization, which does have to, I think, take place, especially when it comes to energy provision, for example. There's no reason why we should be reliant on foreign sources for energy. If we can get the technology to spread appropriately and put the right social relations in place so that they're shared equitably. However, one thing that I must say, given the current state of urbanization, the idea that we can somehow, revert to smaller communities which have more of an rural or agricultural base, I think that's pretty phantasmic at this point. Urbanization has proceeded as we predicted it would. We're at the state now where over 50% of humanity lives in urban areas, and the mega city has really emerged as a political actor of its own right. So, but I agree, small is beautiful in the sense that decisions that are made that affect the environment should be made at a more local level. And of course, foreign investment is always an issue here, because you do have people, as much as they might claim to be concerned about the environment on the ground where they're investing, there is that distance between them and their own livelihoods, right? So the people that are affected, indigenous communities, local communities, rural communities, are not always a part of the decision-making process. And that continues, I think, to plague us. Although organizations like IPIS that I'm working with and others are really trying to stress that point. Let's get back to that, try to restore, if you will, some ecological sovereignty to these areas, which is essential, yes.
Thank you.
But easier said than done, as everything else.
Right. Okay.
By the way, I wanted to mention, I know that one of the most interesting developments in literature, certainly in English literature now, is the advent of what's called cli-fi, right? I don't know if people have heard this expression, but it's a play on science fiction, sci-fi. Depictions of a future world that has, of course, undergone the more extreme, destruction caused by climate change. And it's very interesting. I have a professor in my faculty who's doing some work on this. So I think I really want to look into that. And I would be leaning to the literature community to give me some advice on how to proceed there. but it's very interesting literature because it is sort of based on, Armageddon is coming, the apocalypse is coming, and how that intermingles with the narrative of the continued growth of the human spirit and evolution. Very interesting.
Yeah.
And where are the corporations in this picture? That's my question.
Okay, yes, please. I'm again asking the audience for questions, if there are any. Dear colleagues, I can see Jenny Duvino's name here. And
I say Yelda's name. I say hi to Yelda because she worked with me at one point.
There's a written question here. Let me read the question for you. Do you think the enemy is the same for feminisms and postcolonial studies and queer studies? A question from Muammer Özoltlular. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of intersection
Mhm,
between those all those fields and environment, of course, right? There's a some of the eco-feminist literature that
mhm,
emerged really in the 70s and 80s, even. That's where it began, is very strong, I think, in terms of its condemnation of the clear link between epistemic violence
mhm,
and what's happening on the ground, right? Um, Post-colonial studies as well, of course. I'm not as familiar with queer studies in terms of how that intersects with ecological political ecology. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are very fruitful avenues that could be pursued there as well. But I think overall that many of these critical inquiry approaches to literature and many other subjects of the humanities, yes, they travel very well into this broader discussion, of not only of violence against nature, but also of emancipation, right? And how do we free ourselves, from these structures that we're, to some degree at least, forced to live with.
Thank you, Professor.
thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Jenny, please.
Thank you so much. And I wish I could attend more of the conference, but with the time difference, it's very difficult. That was so interesting. I in the last few years, I've been teaching a book by, oh gosh, why am I spacing his name? But anyway, it's called The Great Derangement. And it's about the need for a new kind of narrative to make us mindful and all of global climate change and so on. And I'm wondering if you have, Peter Stoett, again, thanks so much. If you have thoughts about that, like the need for sort of new stories and new forms of media to make us more mindful of the kinds of violence that we humans as a species are carrying out against so much of the world.
Yeah, I think, and by the way, I've heard of that book. I want to read it, so I'll take your recommendation, and we'll read it too. I have not read that book, so I won't comment on it directly, but I love the title, that's for sure. Well, I think there's a number of approach points, that we really need to focus on. I mean, one obviously is the environmental movement that's been spearheaded by people like Greta Thunberg and others, that, the youth movement really is attached to it, which is to some extent picking up on what happened in the 60s and 70s around the world. But it has a renewed energy, of course, a sense of urgency, and quite frankly, a sense of anger, right, at older generations, which might be misplaced, but certainly at older structures which have enabled, this sort of eco-violence, and that has to be encouraged. I take my kids to the climate marches, and I can be criticized for that, I guess, but whatever. I mean, I think that it's important that youth is very much involved in making. We're on the eve, of course, of a major conference in Glasgow, to try and arrive at more climate solutions or agreements. We're all moving into that pretty cynically, and basically not expecting too much. However, if more gets done there than expected, I think it would be partially, at least, a result of this very vocal, multitudinous approach, which or movement, pardon me, which has taken shape. On the other hand, we also need, the science to back it up. We need empirical evidence of what's happening. And this is my involvement, despite being a social scientist in what is largely a natural science dominated area. My involvement in the IPBES assessment, I view that as an effort, really. These assessments come out, they're pretty authoritative. They've been vetted by governments as well. So there's a big thing in the paper today that you might have seen the news today about how governments try to influence the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for example. Yes, they do try to influence us, but at the same time, we pride ourselves on being neutral, academics and or scientists or scholars, and try to maintain that. And that's got to be there. I think that evidence that this is actually happening. Reports like the ones that I cited in my presentation, in particular the one by Global Witness about violence against earth defenders, if we can call them that. That needs to happen as well. And that's the same story with any human rights issue. If news doesn't get out there, then governments will feel emboldened, and so will organize criminal groups and some of the corporations that they unfortunately work with on occasion. So I think the approach has to be, yes, there's a groundswell. It's come up. I realize, of course, I'm being a bit Eurocentric here. It's not the same in every country. It's quite different around the world, and there are different expressions, I think. But the climate striking that kids are doing, you can go on Twitter and follow. They're in Africa, they're in Australia, they're in places where it's very difficult, actually, in some cases, even where freedom of expression is difficult. That remains a central barrier, though, in some places as well. I won't mention any names, but there are some countries where freedom of expression has been challenged, as we know, quite severely in recent years. Nonetheless, if we can couple the condemnation of human rights abuses with the impact that that's having in many cases on environmental conservation and progress, I think that there's something to be gained from that as well. And then, of course, you need popular literature, which is, I mentioned sci-fi and that sort of thing, movies, whenever we see David Attenborough on Netflix, some people just sort of, oh boy, here we go again, another feel-good Western show about, saving the seals or something. Well, yes, but at the same time, it's getting the ideas out there that are important and getting them into the living rooms of people that otherwise aren't exposed to them. I think that's very vital as well. Ultimately, we'll care more about climate change. There's no question, because it's starting to affect everyone on the ground, especially with the forest fires. Yeah. So yeah, someone mentioned in the chat, Blackfish, for example, right? Which is, I mean, there's a lot of very good shows out there now that one can watch, but they're still largely in English. They're still largely made in the U.S. That needs to expand. Clearly, this cannot be a Western, neo-colonial project. It has to be shared. Yeah. We could go on a lot about that, but thank you for the question, though. It's fascinating, and I think that anything we can do, in my view, to get the ideas out there is constructive.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution, Jenny, and for your answer, Peter. And anybody else? Any more questions? From our colleagues and participants, maybe the students. One last point maybe from me. Do you find this sit as slow movement useful for getting smaller? Because there's an international union of small municipalities in Italy, and if the small towns apply to the institution, they have some criteria to label the town as a slow town.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. Spent a lot of time in Italy, and I think the slow food movement, right, is wonderful. Part of the problem, and this stems largely, I think, from my work on plastic pollution. We could do so much to reduce the amount of plastic pollution that's in our oceans and rivers and lakes, if we were to change the eating lifestyles, right, of people. The slow town movement, I think I think that could be of interest, and certainly in the long run. There are various international organizations now that already link cities, and what's emerging, I think, to some extent, because we've had some politics of neglect, perhaps, and even perhaps, neglect of duty, we could put it that way, from federal governments, is that smaller communities are often picking up the charge, right? And they're having more impact. And if you look at some of these big cities that I mentioned before, they in fact are major contributors to climate change in terms of their spending, their allocation decisions. They're taking more positive steps, in my view, to cut it back than most national governments are. It's less complicated politically for them, perhaps, but nonetheless, that's where things can really get done. So anything like the slow town movement, which is interesting, yeah, I don't know if that's spreading, right? But
Spreading in Europe,
yeah.
In Turkey, for example, we have, I think, 13 slow towns labeled by the organization. The criteria are the population of the town should be lower than 100,000, and there must not be franchised restaurants and franchised supermarkets in the town. There should be local production. There should be shops selling local production. There should be local restaurants. There should be spaces in the town close to motor traffic. And those are the criteria to apply to the union. And if those criteria comply with the institution's principles, they label you as a slow town, city slow, and they give you a snail flag.
A snail flag.
So
okay.
We have, I think, 13 or 14 towns in Turkey that has got it. But the center of the organization is in Italy.
Yes.
So,
yeah, well, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, but I think one of the biggest movements that we have in North America, and it's gone global too, has been something put together by the Ford. Is it the Ford Foundation? I think it is, but which is about resilient cities, right? And rather than that approach to really try and look at smaller cities and change them, what we're getting here is more, how can we be resilient to the changes that are coming? And how can we replace infrastructure? And there's an entire field of urban development now that's based around climate change adaptation. It's less based on changing and slowing things down. It's more about, let's just keep moving, but let's make some technological changes and hope that's the answer. And it's not. I mean, we need deeper answers too. And especially with the links, as you mentioned, to in terms of production, right? Local production. With COVID now, we're finding that, I think it's like this in Europe too, but especially in North America, it has delayed the supply chain of goods that are coming largely from China, right? So now it's impossible to buy anything right now in Canada or the United States. And it just really demonstrates, I think, how dependent we become on these global supply chains that often involve labor that we can't even, labor which is very difficult to monitor, and environmental impacts which are even harder to monitor as well. So,
yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, then. If there aren't any more questions and comments, by your permission, may I call it a night now?
Yes.
Okay, then. Thank you very much for joining us. That's been a wonderful and stimulating session. Thank you very much, Dr. Stoett, for your wonderful talk. And thank you, participants, for joining us. In Turkey, it's getting a bit late at night, but
of course,
we thank you a lot. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and good luck with the rest of your conference.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Okay.